What if your country's existence depended on a single day? Picture this. It's 1948, and a new nation is born into a world that wants to see it crushed before it even stands. 5 armies, well-equipped and vastly outnumbering its defenders, are closing in. The odds of survival? Slim to none. But against all expectations, a small band of determined people are about to pull off one of the most incredible military upsets in history. This is the story of the First Arab-Israeli War, a conflict where the very survival of Israel was on the line. How did a newly formed state, armed with little more than hope and ingenuity, hold off such overwhelming forces? Stay with us as we dive into the gripping and dramatic events that would reshape the Middle East forever. To understand the First Arab-Israeli War, we need to rewind to the early 20th century. Palestine, a region under British control, was home to a majority Arab population with a small but growing Jewish community. The roots of the conflict go even deeper, entangled in religious, historical, and territorial claims. In the aftermath of World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust intensified global sympathy for the Jewish people and their demand for a homeland. The Jewish community pointed to ancient historical ties to the land, while the Arab population saw Palestine as rightfully theirs, an uninterrupted home for generations. Both groups believed they had legitimate claims, but their visions of the future were irreconcilable. Tensions boiled over in 1947 when the United Nations proposed a plan to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. The Jewish community accepted the plan, but the Palestinian Arabs and the surrounding Arab nations vehemently rejected it. They saw the partition as an unjust theft of Arab land, as they would lose key areas, including parts of Jerusalem. Despite Arab resistance, the UN plan went forward and the boundaries were drawn. On May 14, 1948, in the midst of growing tensions, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a momentous occasion for Jews around the world, a culmination of centuries of longing for a homeland. For Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, many of whom had nowhere else to go, the declaration represented a beacon of hope and a new beginning. The declaration was met with jubilation in Jewish communities, but the response from their Arab neighbors was immediate and fierce. For the Palestinian Arabs, this event marked what would later be known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs were displaced from their homes in the areas that were now part of Israel. Many fled in fear of the violence that was to come, while others were forced out as the war unfolded. This exodus of Palestinians became a focal point of the conflict and is still one of the most contentious issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. Israel's birth was not just the result of Jewish determination, but also international diplomacy. In November 1947, the United Nations had voted to partition Palestine into 2 separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. This partition plan, though accepted by the Jewish leadership, was strongly opposed by the Arab world, which saw it as an unjust division of land that had been predominantly Arab for centuries. The boundaries drawn by the UN were highly controversial, with the Jewish state receiving more than half of Palestine's land, even though Jews made up only about 1/3 of the population at the time. Despite the controversy, Israel's declaration of independence was seen by many Jews as the fulfillment of the Zionist dream, a movement that had begun in the late 19th century with the aim of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. However, for the Arab states surrounding Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, the creation of Israel was seen as a direct affront to Arab unity and sovereignty. These nations quickly formed a united front with the goal of preventing the establishment of a Jewish state at all costs. Just hours after Ben-Gurion's declaration, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon mobilized, and war became inevitable. As Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion famously said, "We have been attacked by a coalition of neighboring states. Our future and the existence of our country depend on the courage and endurance of our people." Thus, as Israel took its first breath as a nation, it was immediately thrust into a war for survival. Israel's new government was faced with a monumental challenge to defend its sovereignty against 5 well-established armies that vastly outnumbered and outgunned its fledgling forces. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, Israel prepared to fight. determined to protect its people and its new state. On May 15, 1948, just hours after Israel declared independence, the new nation woke up to an all-out invasion. The armies of 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a coordinated assault. The invasion marked the beginning of what many feared would be the end of the fledgling state. Israel was facing an overwhelming force. The combined Arab armies boasted tens of thousands of soldiers, heavy artillery, tanks, and aircraft, while Israel had only about 35,000 troops, many of whom were civilians with minimal military training. The Israeli forces were poorly equipped, lacking in armored vehicles, and had virtually no air force to counter the Arab aerial assaults. On paper, the situation seemed dire. Israel was heavily outnumbered and underprepared. The Egyptian army, the largest of the Arab forces, invaded from the south, advancing rapidly towards key Israeli towns and aiming to cut off the Negev desert from the rest of the country. Meanwhile, the Jordanian Arab Legion, considered the most formidable Arab fighting force, moved to take control of Jerusalem. Jordan's forces were led by British-trained officers, including General John Glubb, who had a strong strategic advantage. In the north, Syrian forces moved toward the Galilee region, while Iraqi troops entered from the east, joining the Jordanian effort to seize key areas along the West Bank. The Lebanese army also joined the offensive, pushing toward northern Israel. The initial Arab attacks were fierce, with many Israeli towns and villages coming under bombardment. The situation seemed increasingly desperate, and many feared that Israel, in its infancy, might not survive. But despite the overwhelming odds, the Israeli forces were determined. The question was, how long could they hold out? As the war progressed, Israel's ability to defend itself stunned the world. Outnumbered and undersupplied, the Israeli Defense Forces, a newly formed amalgamation of paramilitary groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, showed incredible resilience. For Israel, this was not just a fight for victory, it was a fight to exist. Every battle, every night raid, and every counteroffensive was a desperate attempt to ensure that the nation could survive another day. Israel's soldiers were not just defending their land, they were defending their right to live as a people in their homeland. One of Israel's greatest assets was its unconventional approach to warfare. Israeli commanders quickly realized that engaging in head-to-head combat against the larger and better-equipped Arab armies would be suicidal. Instead, they employed guerrilla tactics, using the terrain to their advantage, launching surprise attacks, and engaging in quick, mobile strikes. Night raids became a crucial part of their strategy, and small units of Israeli fighters would often attack Arab positions under the cover of darkness, disrupting their lines and seizing critical points. Israel's intelligence network also proved invaluable. Many of the Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Europe or neighboring Arab countries brought with them valuable knowledge of Arab languages, culture, and military strategies. This allowed the Israelis to anticipate Arab movements and outmaneuver them. In some cases, Israeli commanders communicated directly with Arab leaders to negotiate local ceasefires, buying time to reinforce their positions. Despite their numbers, the Arab forces were plagued by disorganization and poor coordination. While they were united by their opposition to the Jewish state, the Arab nations had differing goals. Jordan's King Abdullah was more interested in securing control over the West Bank than defeating Israel, while Egypt was focused on expanding its influence in Gaza. These conflicting agendas weakened the Arab alliance, as did internal rivalries and communication breakdowns. The turning point for Israel came in June 1948, when the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. During this pause in fighting, Israel used the opportunity to resupply and regroup. The Israeli government had secretly arranged arms deals with Czechoslovakia, acquiring vital weapons, aircraft, and ammunition that would dramatically shift the balance of power. In contrast, the Arab armies failed to use the ceasefire to their advantage, and their forces began to suffer from low morale and logistical problems. As the fighting resumed, Israel launched a series of counteroffensives that showcased their growing strength and tactical ingenuity. On the southern front, Operation Yoav saw Israeli forces break through Egyptian lines in the Negev desert, securing control of southern Israel. On the central front, Operation Dani resulted in the capture of the Arab towns of Lydda and Ramli, which were crucial for protecting Tel Aviv from Jordanian forces. The Israeli Air Force, which had been virtually non-existent at the start of the war, now began to play a decisive role. With newly acquired planes and experienced pilots from World War II, Israel was able to launch air raids that harassed Arab supply lines and forced Arab forces into retreat. Slowly but surely, the tide of war was turning in Israel's favor. Despite the overwhelming odds at the start of the conflict, by early 1949, Israel had not only survived but had expanded its territory beyond what the original UN partition plan had proposed. The Arab armies, on the other hand, were in disarray, and their united front had crumbled. The First Arab-Israeli War holds several key lessons in military strategy. First, Israel's victory was not just about manpower or weaponry, it was about the willingness of a people to defend their land at all costs. Israel's creative use of guerrilla warfare, intelligence, and the ability to capitalize on ceasefires to regroup was decisive. Another factor was the lack of unity among Arab forces. While they outnumbered the Israelis, their inability to work together led to mismanagement and strategic failures. In contrast, Israel's unity of purpose and centralized command structure allowed them to outmaneuver their enemies, despite being outgunned. The First Arab-Israeli War laid the groundwork for decades of conflict that continued to this day. It showed the world that Israel was here to stay, despite the odds stacked against it. This war was not just a battle over territory, it was a battle for survival and identity. The lessons from this war still resonate in the military strategies and geopolitics of the Middle East. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Tales of History. We are dedicated to bringing you well-researched, engaging content, and your support helps us grow and bring you more of the stories that shaped our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below with your suggestions or questions. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more historical deep dives.